my Connor kids today. Happy spring break. I hope you guys are doing something kind of fun inside. I thought I'd come down into my theater room today. It's nice and quiet down here. It's kind of dark. And I'm going to read you a chapter book. It'll take probably 3 days to get through it. It's pretty fast. It's called SEO Trot by Roald Dahl. And it has really great pictures. Roald Dahl, wrote The Twits and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Big Friendly Giant, James and the Giant Peach. He's a great author. So this one, SEO Trot, is so cute, and I just thought, we'll read a chapter book for a couple of days. And I thought maybe I would put on like a bedtime story tonight. I have a really cute one that I thought I'd read tonight. So if you want to see a bedtime story tonight, stay tuned for later tonight. So, okay, so SEO Trot by Roald Dahl. Here's one of the pictures. Some years ago, when my own children were small, we usually kept a tortoise or two in the garden. In those days, a pet tortoise was a common sight crawling about on the family lawn or in the backyard. You could buy them quite cheaply in any pet shop, and they were probably the least troublesome of all childhood pets and quite harmless. Tortoises used to be brought into England by the thousand, packed in crates, and they came mostly from North Africa. But not many years ago, a law was passed that made it illegal to bring any tortoises into the country, or coronavirus. This was not done to protect us. The little tortoise was not a danger to anybody. It was done purely out of kindness to the tortoise itself. You see, the traders who brought them in used to cram hundreds of them tightly into packing crates without food or water, and in such horrible conditions that a great many of them always died on the sea journey over. So rather than allow this cruelty to go on, the government stopped the whole business. The things you are going to read about in this story all happened in the days when anyone could go out and buy a nice little tortoise from a pet shop. SEO Trot. Here we go. Love the picture. That's Mr. Hoppy. Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone, and he had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in summer the little balcony became a riot of color. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy's jutted out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who always lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from the minute he saw her from his balcony many years ago, but he was very shy, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation, the one looking down from above and the other looking up, but that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy it seemed like 1,000,000 miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him, and as I said, he was a very, very shy man. Oh, if only he had kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous like saving her life or rescuing her from a gang of armed thugs. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only... The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all of her love to somebody else. And that somebody was a small tortoise called Alfie. Every day when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Alfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tortoise himself if it meant Mrs. Silver stroking his shell each morning and whispering endearments to him. So there's cute Alfie. I love that picture. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony in the summer and in the winter. Planks had been placed all around the sides of the balcony so that Alfie could walk about without toppling over the edge, and in one corner there was a cute little house in which Alfie would crawl every night to keep nice and snugly warm. When the cold winter weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver could fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl in there, and he would bury himself deep under the hay, and he would go to sleep for months on end without food or water. This is called hibernating. In the early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony, and Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, "Welcome back, my darling one! Oh, how we've missed you!" It was at times like these that Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Alfie and become a tortoise. Now, we came to a certain bright morning in May, when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. "Here's the heart of lettuce for you, my lovely," she was saying, "and here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery." "Good morning, Mrs. Silver," Mr. Hoppy said. "Alfie's looking well this morning." "Isn't he gorgeous?" Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. "Absolutely gorgeous," Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it. And now as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling face gazing up into his own, he thought for the 1000th time how pretty she was and how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart began to ache with love. "I do so wish he would grow a little faster," Mrs. Silver was saying. "Every spring when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And do you know that in all the 11 years I've had it, he's not gained more than 3 ounces? That's almost nothing." "What does he weigh now?" Mr. Hoppy asked her. "Just 13 ounces," Mrs. Silver answered. "About as much as a grapefruit." "Well, yes, tortoises are very slow growers," Mr. Hoppy said solemnly, "but they can live for 100 years. "I know that," Mrs. Silver said, "but I do so wish he would grow just a little bit bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow." "He seems just as fine as he is," Mr. Hoppy said. "No, he's not just fine," Mrs. Silver cried. "Try to think how miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up." "You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you, Mrs. Hoppy?" Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click, and an amazing idea started rushing into his head. "Well, of course I would," Mrs. Silver said. "I would give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those things, he would turn green with envy." Mr. Hoppy's mind went spinning like a flywheel. Here surely was his big chance. "Grab it," he told himself. "Grab it quick." "Mrs. Silver," he said, "I do actually happen to know how to make a tortoise grow faster, if that's what you really want." "You do?" she cried. "Oh, please tell me. I'm feeding him the wrong things." "Well, I worked in North Africa once," Mr. Hoppy said. "That's where all these tortoises in England come from. And a tribesman told me the secret." "Tell me," cried Mrs. Silver. "I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. I'll be your slave for life." When he heard the words, "your slave for life," a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. "Wait here," he said. "I'll have to go down and write something down for you." That is where we're going to stop today. So you're not going to know what it says until tomorrow. So tune back in tonight if you want to hear a bedtime story. And then we will start part 2 of SEO Trot tomorrow. Okay, have a great day. Bye-bye.